The house smelled of winter and old wood. The radiator hummed low, but the air still carried a damp chill that made my fingers ache when I brushed them against the counter. I woke to the faint scent of melting wax, and at first I thought I'd imagined it, the kind of trick your mind plays when you're half asleep. But then I saw the candle. It stood on the kitchen table, a single pillar of light, flickering as if someone had just set it down. The flame trembled like it was alive, sending shadows skittering across the walls. I froze. The dog didn't bark. The doors were locked. I hadn't heard a single creak, a footstep, a whisper. And yet, here it was, the candle, burning, alone. Beside it lay a folded piece of paper. My name was scrawled across the front in shaky handwriting, rushed and uneven. I didn't recognize it, but I knew it. I knew the weight it carried before I even unfolded it. My chest tightened. The kitchen felt too warm, too still. I set my hands on the table, trying to steady the tremor I didn't know I had. I opened the note slowly. The paper smelled faintly of smoke, like it had traveled through fire to reach me. The words were brief. Look at those closest to you. I read it twice, then again. The handwriting seemed urgent, scared. It held a truth I had spent years trying not to see. My son's inheritance, the money my husband left behind for him, hadn't vanished by accident. It had been taken. I sank into the chair, my fingers tracing the edge of the candle. The wax was still soft. The flame danced. I could hear it, like a pulse in the quiet. My thoughts raced, but only silently, because speaking aloud felt impossible. Who would break into my house just to leave a warning? And why now? After all these years of believing I'd lost everything by mistake. I remembered the day my husband died. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and flowers. He'd left me a note too, tucked inside a worn leather envelope. For our boy. I'd never forgotten it. That promise, simple, sacred, had become my anchor. But in the years since, the bank said it was an error. Neighbors whispered, maybe it'll turn up. And I believed them, because hope is easier than suspicion. But this note, this candle, changed everything. I felt the weight of it settle over my shoulders. I thought of Arif, my late husband's brother, who had offered to handle everything. The phone calls, the paperwork, the transfers. He had seemed helpful, almost kind. Too kind. I remembered how he insisted I not stress myself with details, how he looked away when I asked questions. The candlelight flickered across the memory, and suddenly it wasn't comforting, it was warning. I stared at the flame, letting it tremble against the darkened kitchen walls. The shadows reminded me of all the corners of our lives I had left unexplored. Places I hadn't looked, people I had trusted without thought. A chill ran through me, but not from the winter air. It was the knowledge that someone close, too close, had stolen what was mine, what was my son's. I folded the note carefully, almost reverently, and set it beside the candle. My eyes followed the flame as it bent toward the draft from the slightly open window. The wind whispered against the glass, like it wanted to tell me something too. I didn't move for a long time, just watched. Then I noticed the small details I had always ignored, the faint scuff on the kitchen floor, where someone's shoe had pressed into the old wood, the way the doorknob gleamed under the candlelight, polished as if handled recently. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, just evidence, quiet and unassuming but telling. My stomach churned with a sense I had never let myself admit before. Betrayal often comes in silence. I thought of my son sleeping upstairs, unaware of the note, unaware of the truth it held. My hands tightened around the edge of the table. I wanted to protect him from this knowledge, but I knew I couldn't. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was a promise, and that promise had been broken. I let out a quiet breath and whispered to no one, who would do this? The candle flickered, and for a moment the shadows seemed to lean closer. I could almost feel the presence that had left it. The urgency in the handwriting, the warning embedded in each curve of ink. My life had been calm, quiet, ordered by routine. Now, everything felt tilted, like the house itself was holding its breath. I touched the note again, the paper thin, fragile. The words seemed heavier than ink should allow. Look at those closest to you. I read them one last time and felt a cold certainty settle into my chest. My husband's absence had left a space, one that someone had filled with lies and theft. I didn't move for hours. The candle burned low, the wax pooling like tiny islands of light across the table. The house was silent, except for the hum of the radiator and my own uneven breathing. I thought about the night ahead, the questions I would have to face, the truths I had avoided for years. And I thought about who might be watching. The candle flickered once more, leaning toward the note. I reached out, tracing my fingers over the uneven handwriting, and I knew this was only the beginning. His coat smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and cedar, the kind of smell that makes you think of someone trustworthy, almost comforting. He smiled, and it felt like an anchor in a drifting sea. He took charge. He said, "Let me handle the bank calls, the paperwork. Don't stress yourself." At the time, I didn't question it. The grief was too heavy, too raw, and his words seemed gentle, even necessary. He moved quickly, efficiently, offering to handle the inheritance that had suddenly become a shadow over everything. I watched him work, thinking, finally, someone is helping us carry the burden. But now, sitting in the kitchen with the candle from the first note still smoldering in my mind, I feel the unease I had buried. I remember how he avoided my eyes when I asked questions, the subtle way he shifted, the pause too long before answering, the slight clench in his jaw when I pressed for details. Back then, I told myself I was imagining things, that grief made me paranoid. I wanted to believe him. I needed to. I think about the way he insisted I leave it to him, how he said, "You've lost enough already." At the time, it sounded like care, like a soft hand guiding me. Now, it feels different. I can see the edges of control, the faint shadow of something I didn't want to see. The note in the kitchen, its tremulous warning, echoes the feeling I had felt when he first took over, an unease I had dismissed too quickly. I remember the afternoon he came over with the bank statements, all neatly stacked, the ink fresh on the forms he claimed had just arrived. I touched them, leafed through them, and nodded along as he explained everything in calm, even tones. The way he spoke, the ease in his gestures, it made me trust him without question. But I can still feel the faint resistance I pushed aside, the whisper of doubt I silenced, because hope was easier than suspicion. It wasn't just the handling of money, it was the small moments. How he offered to fix the leaky sink but didn't mention the missing receipt. How he volunteered to drive me to the bank and returned with explanations that felt complete but left out pieces I now realize were vital. I remember telling myself, he's family. He would never. And yet the candle and the note challenged that thought now, like a cold wind through the living room, whispering that trust can be dangerous. I sit by the table, tracing the edge of the wax that pulled from the first candle, thinking about the nights Arif stayed late, supposedly working on documents. The floors creaked under his steps. I remember hearing them, faint and hesitant, but I said nothing. I told myself I was imagining the rhythm, that it was the house settling. I want to believe that, but I can't. There's a picture on the mantel, one of my husband, Arif, and my son, all smiling under the summer sun. I stare at it and feel a tightening in my chest. The man in the photograph looks like a protector, a kind face bending toward my boy. The man now, the one who helped too much, feels different, calculated, careful, watching, waiting. The candlelight flickers, painting his absence across the walls of my memory, and I realize that someone I thought was a savior might have been the thief all along. I reach for my cup of tea, long cold on the counter, and blow across it, watching the steam curl lazily into the air. The house is quiet, but I can hear the faint echo of Arif's past presence in every corner. The cupboard he opened, the papers he moved, the soft words he said to keep me calm. I understand now that calm can be a weapon, a way to quiet suspicion until it's too late. The memory cuts deeper when I recall the night I first suspected something. It was subtle, almost laughable in its smallness, a misfiled statement, a number that didn't add up, a casual excuse he gave me that didn't quite match the papers. I laughed it off, told myself I was imagining things. And now the note in my kitchen, the trembling handwriting, the candlelight whispering of betrayal, it brings the truth into focus I had refused to see. I think of my son upstairs, sleeping, oblivious to the quiet tension threading through our lives. I imagine him trusting, like I did, believing that family protects, that the world honors promises. And I wonder, what does he deserve to know? What did I deserve to find out after all these years? The candle's flame flickers against the wall again, casting shadows that feel like questions. Who truly helped us, and who quietly took what was ours? I trace the words in my mind, look at those closest to you, and feel the weight of it settle. It isn't just a warning, it's a mirror held up to the ones we trust most. I sit in silence, the winter chill creeping back into the edges of the room, and I realize that trust can be a trap. And sometimes the people who help too much are the ones we should watch the closest. I take a deep breath and whisper, almost to myself, how could I have been so blind? The candle burns lower, shadows drift across the walls, and for the first time, I see the outlines of a truth I cannot ignore. The inheritance wasn't lost, it was stolen. The house smelled faintly of old paper and dust when I opened the filing cabinet in the corner of the study. The drawers creaked like they remembered every hand that had ever touched them. I hadn't been here in years, not since the week of the inheritance transfer, not since I told myself some things were easier left unseen. But the note, that trembling message beside the candle,
had awoken a part of me I thought I had buried.
I pulled open the top drawer and sifted through the papers. Receipts, bank statements, letters from my husband, notes he had left me in careful handwriting, each one a quiet echo of his presence. My fingers trembled, brushing over them, tracing the dates and numbers that suddenly felt heavier than they had before. The air in the room was colder, sharper, like it knew what I was about to discover. At first, I found nothing unusual. The papers lay as they always had, familiar, comforting even. But then, I noticed it. A transfer form I had never seen before. The ink looked fresh, too fresh, compared to the faded documents around it. My heart skipped. Arif's name was scrawled in the margin, the same neat handwriting he had always used to reassure me. I remembered how he insisted he had mailed it himself, a small act of kindness, or so I thought. I held the paper in my hands, feeling its weight. The edges were crisp, the signature too smooth. Practiced. I knew my husband's handwriting intimately, every curve, every slant. This wasn't his. My breath caught. My hands shook as I realized how little I had verified, how quickly I had trusted him to carry everything for me, how easy it had been to ignore the small inconsistencies, the quiet alarms that should have warned me. The study felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in, heavy with the ghosts of decisions I had made in grief. I remembered the mornings I sat here with my tea, going over bills and letters, thinking I was in control. I wasn't. Someone else had been moving the pieces quietly, carefully, in a game I had only just begun to notice. I spread the documents across the desk. Receipts lined up like markers of a trail, dates that didn't match, numbers slightly off, signatures that looked just familiar enough to fool me. The air smelled faintly of wax from the candle I had left burning downstairs, mingling with the cold scent of paper. I could feel the tension pressing in on me, not loud, not dramatic, just insistent, like the hush of a river before it shifts beneath the ice. My mind wandered back to Arif's visits, the papers he brought, the calm explanations, the way he avoided my gaze when I pressed for details. I had wanted to believe him. I needed to. But now, every gesture, every careful smile, every insistence that I not worry, lined up like puzzle pieces I had ignored for too long. I shivered. Silence had been my refuge. I told myself that ignoring questions was easier than facing what might be true. But now, retracing his steps through these documents, I could see how deliberately he had taken advantage of that silence. The thought made my stomach knot and my chest ache. I touched a stack of letters my husband had written me before he died. His handwriting was familiar, steady, comforting. I traced each line slowly, almost reverently, and then I laid the transfer form beside it. The contrast was sharp, almost cruel. One was love, one was deceit, and I had been blind. The more I searched, the more gaps I noticed, forms missing, signatures absent, notes that didn't match previous correspondence. Each discovery was small, almost trivial on its own, but together, they built a picture that made my breath hitch. Someone had manipulated everything, hidden everything in plain sight, while I clung to hope and trust like a lifeline. I pressed my hands to my face and let out a quiet, unsteady breath.
The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. I felt the weight of years pressing down, of decisions made in grief, of trust given too easily. And with it came a bitter clarity. The inheritance hadn't been lost. It had been taken.
The realization made the room feel colder still. I looked at the papers again, at the carefully arranged trail of deception. I thought of my son upstairs, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the careful, deliberate theft that had shaped his future. A pang of guilt twisted through me. I had tried to protect him, to shield him from loss, and yet the truth had been hidden from both of us by someone so close, so trusted, that I had never considered the possibility. I folded the forged transfer form and placed it carefully atop the stack of letters. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of understanding. The quiet, slow burn of betrayal pressed against my ribs like ice. How many other small lies had I accepted as kindness? How many warnings had I ignored because hope seemed easier? The room grew dimmer as the afternoon sun slipped behind clouds. Shadows crept along the walls, merging with the edges of the papers, as if to remind me that deception often comes quietly, unnoticed until it can't be ignored any longer. I exhaled slowly, my chest tight. The candle's glow from the kitchen drifted faintly upstairs, a reminder that the note, the warning, was only the beginning. Someone had left me a path, a trail. I could follow it, piece by piece, or I could pretend the silence of the past was enough. But I knew, with the clarity that made my stomach ache, that I could no longer pretend. The inheritance had been stolen. The papers whispered it to me in a quiet, relentless voice. And now, I would have to follow the trail, wherever it led. The market smelled of salt, fish, and old wood. Early morning sunlight filtered through the canvas awnings, painting stripes across the cobblestones. I walked slowly, letting the crowd carry me along, pretending I was just browsing. But really, I was listening for the threads of conversation that might unravel the truth I had just begun to trace. The vendors called out their prices, their voices low and rhythmic, blending with the clatter of baskets and the murmur of neighbors. I passed the familiar stalls without looking too closely at the wares, focusing instead on the familiar faces, some friendly, some cautious. Everyone here knew everyone else's story. I just needed to hear the right one. I stopped at the fish stall, where the vendor, an older man named Rahim, arranged silver-scaled fish on ice. He noticed me immediately, squinting in the sun. "It's been a while," he said, his voice soft, not casual, the kind of soft that held memories. He didn't look at me directly, as though he already knew what I was about to ask. I nodded, my fingers brushing the edge of my purse. "Yes, I need to ask you something about a long time ago." His eyes narrowed slightly. "About Arif?" I froze. His words weren't loud, but they struck me like a bell in the quiet morning. I nodded slowly, and he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Why now?" he asked. His tone wasn't accusatory, it was wary, protective, like he had held this knowledge too long and feared it would burn him if spoken aloud. He leaned closer, lowering his voice, even though no one was near. "I saw him with the bank manager late one night, years ago. They argued, heated. I didn't know what it was about, but it wasn't small talk." My stomach twisted. The words sank into me like stones dropped in a still pond, sending ripples through everything I thought I knew. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered.
though I already knew the answer. Rahim shrugged, the lines on his face deepening. I was afraid of what he could do if people knew, afraid you'd be in danger. Some things are better left unspoken. His hesitation pressed against my chest, like the winter wind cutting through the market stalls. I realized that this town, small, quiet, seeming so ordinary, had witnessed more than I had allowed myself to see. Secrets move slowly, but they always leave traces. I listened as he described the night again, the gestures, the quiet urgency in Arif's voice, the tension that seemed out of place for two men in the village who usually kept smiles for everyone. The way Rahim remembered it made me see the scene in my mind. The moonlight glinting off the bank manager's window, shadows crossing the street, whispers that traveled only through fear. I remembered how Arif always came across as helpful, calm, in control. And yet, Rahim's words painted a different picture. Calculated, careful, watching, waiting. The candle in my kitchen, the note with shaky handwriting, the forged transfer forms, all of it fit together now, in quiet, almost invisible lines that connected the man I trusted with the man who had stolen from us. I looked around the market at familiar faces going about their day. Children laughing, women haggling over fruit, a dog sleeping in a patch of sun. Everyone here had seen pieces of stories they never spoke aloud. I realized that sometimes the truth hides in plain sight, whispered only to those brave enough or foolish enough to ask. Rahim handed me a small piece of paper with nothing written on it, just a direction. If you want to know more, follow the path, quietly, carefully. Not everyone will want you to see the truth. I tucked it into my pocket, feeling the weight of it against my fingers. It wasn't just a note, it was a map, a guide to the next step in uncovering what had been stolen from my son, from our family.
The sun shifted, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. I breathed in the sense of fish, smoke, and bread, letting them anchor me to the present, even as my mind traced the threads of the past. I realized that the inheritance, the money, the promise, was tied not just to Arif, but to the silences of everyone around him. I left the market slowly, the crowd swallowing me as I walked. My mind repeated Rahim's words, quietly, carefully. Not everyone will want you to see the truth. The warmth of the morning sun felt sharp against my skin, like a warning. When I reached home, the candle from the kitchen seemed dimmer than before, its light hesitant. I placed my hand on the wax, still warm, still flickering, and I whispered to myself, I am following the trail now, and I will not stop. The shadows on the walls stretched longer as afternoon crept in. The quiet of the house felt heavier, the weight of the past pressing against it like an invisible hand. Every step I took, every paper I unfolded, every whisper I heard, it all led me closer to the truth. And I understood, finally, that uncovering it would require more than courage. It would require patience, observation, the careful gathering of quiet knowledge, piece by piece, until the story could no longer hide in the silence. The market had whispered, and I had listened. I didn't intend to open my drawer. Not at first. It had been years since I touched it. The one tucked in the corner of the kitchen,
forgotten beneath years of bills, letters, and the dusts of ordinary life. But the note, the candle, the whispers from the market, they pressed me forward, a quiet insistence I could no longer ignore. The handle was cool under my fingers as I lifted the drawer. It creaked, slow and hesitant, like the house itself was holding its breath. Inside were papers, receipts, and envelopes I had long considered harmless. A record of payments, a few personal letters from friends, old photographs. Everything seemed familiar at first glance, comforting even. But then my eyes landed on one document, and the air felt suddenly colder. It was a receipt, dated the week of the inheritance transfer. My husband's signature was there, neat and familiar. At least, that's what I thought at first. The ink looked darker, fresher than it should have after all these years. My chest tightened. Something about the strokes, the curves of the letters, the slant of the pen felt wrong. Not wrong in the way a child fakes a signature, but wrong in a quiet, deliberate way. Calculated. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I lifted the paper carefully, laying it on the table. The wax from the candle I had left burning earlier still glowed faintly, casting a tremulous light across the ink. I traced the letters with the finger, imagining my husband's hand, steady and sure, forming these shapes. This wasn't his. I could almost hear his soft sigh, the one he reserved for moments of frustration when the world demanded too much. He wouldn't have signed this way. My mind drifted back to Arif, the man who had helped too much, who had taken charge when grief blurred my judgment. The calm explanations, the smooth assurances, the careful avoidance of my questions. I could feel the pattern emerge, thin but sharp, like ice forming over a river. The ink on this receipt was a key. Small, subtle, but undeniable. I sorted through the rest of the drawer slowly, deliberately, letting my hands linger over each paper. Other documents seemed off too. Small inconsistencies in dates, signatures that didn't match previous letters. Each one was a quiet echo, a whisper of a deception I had been blind to for years. I felt the weight of it pressing into my chest, not sudden or loud, but steady, undeniable. The kitchen felt colder now. Shadows stretched along the walls, merging with the flickering candlelight. The quiet tick of the old clock seemed amplified, each second marking the slow revelation that my trust had been misplaced. Betrayal doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits, patient, and works quietly, folding itself into the ordinary until it can't be ignored any longer. I thought of my son, sleeping upstairs, unaware that the inheritance meant for him had been touched by someone else's hand. I thought of all the nights I had reassured him, promised him, told him it would all be okay, and I felt the ache of failure, not because I had lost the money, but because I had failed to see the signs, the small cracks in the truth, the subtle threads of deceit. I folded the receipt carefully, placing it atop the other papers I had pulled from the drawer. I could feel the texture of the ink under my fingertips, the slight raised edges where the pen had pressed too firmly. I could almost imagine Arif's hand, deliberate, careful, shaping a lie that would last for years. And I realized with a cold certainty that he had everything to gain. The room was silent, except for the whisper of the wind through the slightly open window. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves outside, a soft reminder that the world continued, even as I uncovered what had been hidden. The candle's flame danced across the walls, flickering over the shadows of the papers, painting them with the light that felt both fragile and revealing. I sat down, my back against the kitchen chair, holding the papers close. The ache in my chest was quiet, but persistent. I realized that this drawer, forgotten, overlooked, had been holding a secret all along. And I, in my trust, had left it untouched, blind to the quiet manipulations that had shaped my life, my son's future, everything I thought I knew. I closed the drawer slowly, letting the click of the handle echo in the kitchen. The papers would stay there for now, but I knew I couldn't ignore them. I had to follow the trail. Piece by piece, I had to uncover the truth hidden in ink and shadows, and small gestures and silent words. The candle flickered again, casting long shadows across the floor. I traced the wax pool with my finger, thinking of the note that had started this. Trembling handwriting, urgent, warning me to look closer. And now I understood. The inheritance had been stolen, carefully, quietly, and the first proof was here, in my hands, in a forgotten drawer. I exhaled slowly. The quiet of the kitchen pressed around me, heavy and knowing, and I whispered to myself, I will find out who did this and why. The living room felt smaller than usual that evening. The candle on the kitchen table had burned low, its faint glow spilling into the room, casting shadows that stretched across the walls. My son sat beside me on the worn couch, his shoulders hunched slightly, hands folded together as if bracing for words he didn't yet understand. The quiet between us felt heavy, weighted with years I had carried alone. I didn't know how to start. For years I had kept the truth tucked away, hidden beneath explanations that felt easier than confrontation. I told him the inheritance had been lost, a misplacement, a mistake beyond our control. I thought I was protecting him. But now, with the candle's trembling light and the papers spread across the table, I could no longer shield him. I took a deep breath, tracing the edge of the couch with my hand. I need to tell you something, I said softly, almost afraid to break the silence. He looked at me then, eyes wide, alert, sensing the weight in my voice. About the money, about the inheritance. He waited, quiet, patient, and for a moment I envied his calm, the way he absorbed words without interruption, without panic. I told him about the note, the handwriting shaky and urgent, warning me to look at those closest to us. I told him about the papers, the inconsistencies, the receipt with the ink that wasn't my husband's, the documents that didn't match. He listened quietly, nodding slowly, processing the betrayal he had never expected to face. Not from strangers, not from the world, but from family. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint crackle of the candle and the low hum of the radiator. I realized how heavy this revelation was, even in its quiet telling. I spoke about Arif, about the man who had helped too much, about the reassurances I had trusted blindly. I told him how the documents, the whispers from the market, the signs I had ignored, all pointed to something I had refused to see for years. Someone had taken what was meant for him. He reached for my hand, small and warm in mine. The gesture carried more than comfort. It carried a shared understanding, the unspoken acknowledgement of loss, of betrayal, of trust broken. "Why would Uncle Arif steal from us?" he asked, voice barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the air like glass. I didn't have an answer yet. I shook my head, letting the words fall into the quiet room. "I don't know," I said, my throat tight. "But we're going to find out. I promise you." He squeezed my hand gently, and in that moment I saw something shift. The fear, the confusion, the quiet resentment of years past, it softened, replaced with the determination of a child who finally sees the truth and knows that the world, though flawed, can be confronted. I remembered all the nights he had blamed me for losing his future, for the money that had disappeared in the wake of my husband's death. I thought of the heavy burden I had carried silently, the explanations I had given to shield him from worry. And now the truth was ours to bear together. The betrayal, the deception, the stolen inheritance. It was a shared weight, and somehow sharing it made it lighter. The candle flickered again, sending shadows across the walls. I could see the soft lines of his face illuminated by the gentle light, the way his eyes reflected both fear and hope. I knew he understood more than I could say, that life could be cruel, that trusts could be broken, but that some truths, once uncovered, could also set you free. I told him about the steps I had already taken, the papers, the market whispers, the drawer where the first evidence had been hidden. He listened with an intensity that made my chest ache, not with sorrow, but with recognition of how deeply this moment mattered. The quiet stretched between us, filled with the unspoken questions of what would come next. I could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on me, to protect him, to guide him, to right what had been wronged. And yet, I knew I could not do it alone. I needed to uncover every truth, no matter how small, no matter how long it had been hidden. He leaned against me, and I felt the steadiness of his presence. The warmth of his hand in mine reminded me why I had to continue. Not for me, not even for the money, but for him, for the future he deserved, for the promise my husband had made to him years ago. I whispered softly, more to myself than to him, "We will find the truth, and we will set it right." The candle's flame flickered low, the shadows stretching across the walls like quiet witnesses to our conversation. I could feel the turning of a page, the start of a path I could no longer avoid. My son's eyes, wide and unblinking, held a courage I didn't know he had. And I realized, finally, that this journey was as much his as it was mine. The room settled into silence again, the quiet heavy but no longer suffocating. And for the first time in years, I felt a spark of hope, fragile, trembling, but real. The knock at the door came late, soft and measured, like it was testing the silence before it entered. I had just put my son to bed, the candle from the kitchen still burning low, casting long shadows across the walls. My heart skipped, not in fear exactly, but in recognition. The night was quiet, but not empty. Someone had come, and I didn't know who. I moved slowly to the door, each step careful, deliberate. The wooden floor creaked under my weight, a sound far too loud in the stillness. I opened it a crack, peering into the darkness. The man standing there was Rahim, the fish vendor from the market. His face was partially hidden by the dim glow of the street light, but I could see the worry etched into his features, the way his hands clutched a small envelope against his chest. I had to tell you, he said, voice low, almost trembling. I saw him, Arif, leaving the bank manager's house that night before the inheritance disappeared.
I blinked, letting the words settle. My chest tightened, a cold knot forming where hope had briefly rested. I had feared this confirmation, the final piece of the puzzle I had been chasing in whispers and shadows. And now it was here, standing before me, in the quiet of my doorway. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The question felt unnecessary. The answer was written across his face. "I was afraid," he admitted, "of what he could do, of what he might do if anyone found out I saw. I stayed silent for my own safety." His eyes flicked away, then back at mine, pleading for understanding. I shouldn't have stayed silent, but I didn't know how to help without putting myself in danger. I nodded slowly, understanding more than I wanted to. Fear can silence witnesses, can twist their intentions, can leave the truth buried beneath years of quiet. Rahim handed me the envelope, the paper soft and fragile in my hands. Inside were notes he had scribbled, dates, observations, small details I hadn't known. Every word was a key, unlocking doors I had been too afraid to open. The night pressed close around us. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint rustles that made the house feel alive, listening. I could feel the pulse of the past, the weight of years of deception, and the realization that Arif had been moving in shadows long before I suspected. I thought of the bank manager, of the quiet authority he wielded, and of the control Arif must have exerted to manipulate even him. The pieces I had gathered, the candle, the note, the forged papers, Rahim's account, began to fit together, forming a pattern of calculated theft that had taken years to reveal. I invited Rahim inside, careful to keep the candlelight low so that its flicker didn't betray the moment's gravity. We sat at the kitchen table, and he explained in hushed tones the sequence of that night. Arif had left the manager's house carrying documents, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention, just the quiet work of a man who knew how to cover his tracks. Every gesture, every step had been deliberate. I listened, tracing the edge of the candle wax with my finger, feeling the tremor of its flame echo in my chest. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It had a shape, a form, a timeline. I could see it clearly now, and the ache it brought was sharp, unrelenting, but real. Rahim paused, his voice dropping even lower. I didn't say anything before because I was afraid of what he might do, but now, seeing you, he's already lost control. You know more than anyone else, and he can't stop what's coming next. The words left a residue in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. I realized, finally, that I could not go backward, could not retreat into the quiet comfort of ignorance. The night,
demanded action, demanded that I follow the trail Rahim had illuminated. He left soon after, slipping quietly into the darkness, leaving me alone with the envelope and the candle. I held the notes in my hands, feeling their weight like stones, small but substantial, each one pressing the truth further into my chest. My son slept upstairs, unaware of the revelation, unaware of the careful, deliberate work that had been done to steal his inheritance. I sank into the chair, letting the shadows and candlelight settle around me. The air smelled faintly of smoke and wax, of paper and old wood. Everything in the room seemed quieter now, as if the house had exhaled, holding the moment of revelation between its walls. I whispered to no one, letting the words float into the night. It's true. He did it. The simplicity of the statement felt heavier than any accusation I had made in years. It was a fact now, undeniable, pressing, and urgent. The candle flickered, small and fragile, its light trembling against the darkness, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls. I traced its glow with my eyes, thinking of the next steps, the careful collection of evidence, the confrontation that had to come. And I realized, with a cold certainty, that the inheritance was no longer just a missing sum of money. It was proof of betrayal, proof of manipulation, and proof that those closest to us could sometimes be the ones we needed to watch the most. I held the notes against my chest for a long moment, feeling their truth press against me. And as the candle burned low, I knew the path forward was clear. Uncover every detail, follow every whisper, and confront the man who had taken what belonged to my son. The night stretched on, quiet, cold, and heavy with anticipation. And I understood, finally, that this was only the beginning. I cleared my throat, my voice cutting through the quiet. Arif. He turned slowly, watering can in hand. He smiled, the same easy practice smile he had always used, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was a flicker there, a hesitation, a crack in the facade. I felt a thrill of recognition, like the moment a window opens after years of being sealed. I need to talk to you, I said, keeping my voice steady, careful. The papers, the notes, the whispers, all of it pressed behind my ribs, demanding to be acknowledged. He set the watering can down, wiping his hands on a cloth. About what? He asked, casually, too casually. I stepped closer, letting the frost crunch underfoot, the cold seeping through my boots, sharpening my focus. About the inheritance, about the note, the papers, the transfers, the truth. Did you forge my husband's signature? For a moment, he froze. The air between us grew taut, as though it too held its breath. His smile faltered, just slightly, a small crack that revealed more than any confession could. I saw the hesitation, the careful pause, the way his eyes darted for a reaction. You're imagining things, he said finally, his voice measured, calm, too calm. Grief can do that to people. It twists memories. I shook my head, stepping closer, letting the winter wind bite at my face. I remember everything. The drawer, the papers, the market, Rahim's witness. I have the notes, the forged receipt, the trail you left behind. Don't try to deny it. His hands tightened at his sides. I could see the tension ripple across his frame, the careful control cracking under pressure. He opened his mouth, closed it again. The silence pressed against us, heavy like snow before it falls. You think I would, he began, voice wavering, searching for words but failing to mask the truth. I didn't answer. I let the winter air carry the weight of his hesitation, the evidence I had collected, the quiet certainty that had built over months of tracing the trail. The shadows of the yard stretched long, echoing the tension, painting him in the light of accountability. "Why?" I whispered finally, almost to myself, but loud enough for him to hear. "Why take what belonged to my son?" He looked away, the lines in his face deepening, his jaw tight. His fingers twitched, a subtle gesture that spoke more than words ever could. And in that silence, I understood. If he was innocent, he wouldn't look like a man cornered. But he did. I remembered the years of small manipulations, the moments of false calm, the insistence that I not worry, not question, not see. It all converged here, in the yard, in the crisp winter light, in the silent acknowledgement of betrayal. The flowers he had tended seemed absurdly peaceful, their colors vivid against the frost. The juxtaposition of beauty and deception hit me sharply. Life goes on. Even as trust is broken, even as innocence is stolen. But truth has a way of catching up. He swallowed hard, his lips pressed into a thin line. I did what I had to, he said finally, voice low, almost a whisper. I thought no one would notice. I thought it would be easier for you, for everyone. I felt a cold wave of anger and sorrow wash over me, tempered by the clarity that had taken months to reach. This wasn't about kindness, not really. It was about control, about calculation, about taking what belonged to another while wearing the mask of family. I exhaled slowly, letting the winter air fill my lungs. You took what was mine to protect, what belonged to my son, and now the truth is out. The notes, the witnesses, they'll see it too. He looked at me then, eyes wide, cornered, and for a fleeting moment, I saw fear. Not fear of me exactly, but of exposure, of being stripped of the careful, quiet control he had exercised for so long. The wind shifted, carrying the faint rustle of leaves, the distant sound of a crow, the quiet of a yard that held more than just flowers. The confrontation was not violent, not loud, but its weight pressed against the air, and I knew this moment would be remembered. I stepped back, letting the silence settle between us. The frost on the ground glimmered, the early sun casting long shadows across the yard. I realized then that this was only the beginning, a necessary step in unearthing everything and righting what had been wronged. RF didn't speak again. He only stared, the faint crack in his smile still visible, a silent acknowledgement of guilt. The flowers, the frost, the early light, all bore witness to what had been done and to what would come next. I turned and walked back to the house, the gravel crunching underfoot, the air crisp and biting. The inheritance, the betrayal, the truth, it was all waiting, and now, so was justice. The house at the edge of the hills looked smaller than I remembered, tucked beneath trees that shivered in the morning wind. I knocked lightly, the sounds muted by the distance from the road. When the door opened, the bank manager stood there, older than I had pictured, his shoulders stooped, eyes darting like a man unused to visitors. "Mrs. Selina," he said, voice wavering, almost shy. "I wasn't expecting anyone." I stepped inside quietly, careful to close the door behind me without a sound. The house smelled faintly of tea, old paper, and wood smoke. It was quiet in a way that made my chest tighten, the silence carrying the weight of years, of secrets kept carefully, hidden in polite nods and small lies. "I need to speak to you about Arif," I said softly. My voice was calm, deliberate, but it carried the weight of everything I had discovered. The notes, the forged papers, the market whispers, the night visit. He stiffened instantly, a subtle shift that told me I was already right. I I don't know what you mean," he said, eyes darting to the side, then back at me. "It's been years. I don't remember anything unusual." I reached slowly into my bag and pulled out the receipt, the one with the signature that wasn't my husband's. I laid it carefully on the table between us. The candlelight I had brought along flickered faintly, casting tremulous shadows across the ink. He froze, a small, almost imperceptible tremor running through his hand. I could feel it. I didn't speak, only waited, letting the weight of the evidence settle over him like snow. Finally, his voice cracked, low, hoarse. I I didn't want to. I never imagined it would go this far. His eyes darted away, shame and fear tangled in the lines of his face. He ran a hand over his mouth as if to hold back words he couldn't yet speak. I stayed quiet, letting the moment stretch. Silence has a way of pulling truth from the depths when words alone cannot. I, Reef, he pressured me, he admitted finally, voice small, almost a whisper. He threatened, said he'd expose an old mistake I made years ago if I didn't misplace the funds. My breath caught. The final piece I had needed was here, whispered into the quiet of a small house by the hills. The betrayal, the meticulous planning, the years of deceit, it all lined up. Arif had manipulated everyone, used fear to cover his tracks, and stolen what was meant for my son. The bank manager's hands trembled as he reached for the receipt, eyes glistening. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I I couldn't sleep knowing I'd allowed it to happen. His voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw him not as an authority figure, but as a man burdened by guilt, powerless to undo the consequences of his silence. I felt the ache of years fold in on itself, the weight of trust misplaced, the quiet suffering of my son, the nights spent sleepless, wondering where the money had gone. And now, standing in the warmth of this small, quiet house, I understood the depth of the deception. "I need to know everything," I said softly. "Every detail, the dates, the documents, what he threatened you with." He nodded, swallowing hard, his shoulders trembling. I I can tell you. I will tell you. I cannot live with this guilt any longer. If you need me to testify, I will. I'll do whatever it takes to set it right." The words hung in the air, heavy but hopeful. Justice, finally, was beginning to take shape. The theft, the betrayal, the quiet manipulation that had stretched across years and silenced witnesses, it all had a witness now, a voice willing to speak. I reached across the table, placing a gentle hand over his. "Thank you," I whispered. Not for the confession itself, but for the courage it took to give it. The road to truth is always slower than we hope and more painful than we expect. But this was a step forward. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying faint echoes of the town below. Life moved slowly, quietly, as if it too had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment of revelation. I left the house with the envelope in my hands, feeling the weight of both evidence and relief pressing together. The inheritance could be restored. The stolen future of my son could finally be reclaimed. But the quiet ache of betrayal lingered, a shadow that would take longer to fade. The candlelight of the kitchen, still faint in my mind, flickered as I walked back home. It was small, fragile, but persistent, just like the truth I had begun to uncover, one paper, one witness, one whisper at a time. And I knew, finally, that the path ahead, confronting Arif, restoring what had been stolen, would require all the courage I could summon. But for the first time in years, the pieces were falling into place. The truth, at last, had a voice. I returned home that evening to a quiet house, the faint chill of autumn pressing against the windows. The candle I had left burning earlier was still on the kitchen table, its flame low, trembling like a fragile heartbeat. And beside it lay another note. I froze. My hands hovered over the paper for a long moment, reluctant to touch it, afraid that the fragile words inside might shatter with the warmth of my breath. Slowly, carefully, I unfolded it. The handwriting was familiar in its shakiness. The bank manager's hand, trembling with fear and relief, the ink blotchy in places as if he had written it in a rush to unburden himself. The note began with apologies, simple and quiet. I am sorry. I could not live with this guilt any longer. Everything that happened, it was under pressure, but that is no excuse. I want to make it right. The words pressed against my chest, the weight of years of stolen truth finally landing in my hands. I read on, slowly, each sentence a deliberate confession. He wrote of Arif's threats, the manipulation, the quiet coercion that forced him to misplace the inheritance. He explained the details I had suspected but could not yet confirm: the forged signatures, the misfiled documents, the transfers that never reached the accounts they were meant for. Every word was a key turning in a lock, opening doors I had long thought sealed. He wrote of his fear, his shame, the nights he had lain awake, knowing that my son's future had been stolen while he remained silent. He admitted he had tried to stay hidden, to hope that someone else would find the courage to uncover the truth. And now, finally, he was speaking, choosing the fragile light of confession over the suffocating darkness of silence. The candle flickered across the paper, its glow warm and steady. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of its truth. The fragile flame mirrored the trembling handwriting, a small, persistent light cutting through years of deceit. I realized that this note was more than a confession. It was a promise to testify, to support the restoration of what had been stolen, to finally give my son the future he deserved. I looked around the quiet kitchen, the shadows stretching long across the floorboards. The house felt alive in the stillness, listening, waiting. I felt the air shift, heavy with relief, but still tinged with the ache of betrayal. So much time had passed in silence. So much had been taken in quiet. And now, with this second note, the fragile thread of justice had begun to form. I remembered my son upstairs, asleep, unaware of the careful unraveling of truth happening in the rooms below. I could almost see him, small and vulnerable, yet carrying within him the weight of what had been stolen. The note would not undo the past, but it could restore what was rightfully his. It could reclaim the promise that had been broken years ago. I folded the paper gently, placing it atop the other documents I had collected. The warmth of the candle illuminated the edges of the envelope, casting small, dancing shadows across the table. I traced them with my eyes, feeling the rhythm of light and darkness echo the rhythm of the story, one of betrayal, fear, and finally, revelation. The house was still, the faint hum of the night pressing in against the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the quiet sense of earth and fallen leaves. I breathed deeply, letting the air fill my lungs, letting the weight of the note press against me with both burden and relief. I whispered softly, almost to myself, "This is the beginning of justice and the end of silence." The words felt fragile, like the candle flame, yet undeniably true. I could feel the path ahead clearer now. The confrontation, the evidence, the restoration of what had been taken. It was all within reach. And the note, trembling in my hands, was a guide, a light in the quiet, fragile darkness. The candle flickered one last time before settling into a steady glow. I sat back, letting the warmth seep into my fingers, into my chest, into the corners of a house that had witnessed so much. And I knew that tomorrow, when I finally faced Arif with both the bank manager and a lawyer, the truth would no longer hide. For the first time in years, I felt the fragile edges of hope. It was soft, trembling, delicate, but it was enough. And I held it close, careful not to let it go. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and warm, casting long golden lines across the living room floor. My son sat beside me on the couch, alert but quiet, the first hints of understanding reflected in his eyes. Today, everything would change. The truth, long buried in shadows, was finally ready to be spoken aloud. The lawyer arrived first, briefcase in hand, followed by the bank manager whose hands still trembled slightly, but whose eyes were steady with resolve. And then, the moment I had dreaded and anticipated, Arif stepped into the room. His smile was practiced, calm, but the weight of evidence behind me, the notes, the receipts, the confessions, pressed against the air like a storm waiting to break. I felt my son squeeze my hand, small and steady. The gesture anchored me. For years, I had carried the burden of betrayal alone. Now, he was here, beside me, a quiet presence reminding me why I could not falter. The confrontation began quietly. I laid the papers on the table, one by one, letting them speak for themselves. The bank manager nodded, confirming every detail, every pressure, every manipulated signature. The lawyer's pen moved swiftly across his notebook, capturing the weight of the truth as it unfolded. Arif's face changed, the practiced calm dissolving into hesitation, then into thinly veiled panic. His eyes darted from me to the papers, then to my son, then back to the bank manager. I spoke softly but firmly. "This inheritance belongs to my son. You stole what was never yours to take. And now, the truth is here for everyone to see." His mouth opened, closed, words failing him. He tried to claim innocence, to twist memories, to suggest that grief and confusion had clouded my judgment. But the evidence, the witnesses, the painstaking collection of every fact, every note, every whisper from yours past, pressed down on him like the slow, unrelenting tide. I looked at my son, watching his expression shift from cautious hope to quiet clarity. For the first time, he understood that the burden he had carried, the loss, the uncertainty, the mistrust, was not his fault. The future his father had intended for him was no longer out of reach. The lawyer spoke now, gently but firmly, outlining the steps to restore the inheritance, to correct the mismanaged accounts, to ensure that what was taken would be returned. Arif remained silent, cornered not by anger, but by the weight of undeniable truth. My son's hand found mine again, warm and reassuring. I could feel the tension in his small grip ease, replaced by the subtle rise of relief and understanding. The injustice that had shadowed our lives for years was finally being lifted. And though the money could never erase the betrayal, it could restore what had been promised. Arif's denial faltered further, and finally he slumped back in his chair, a quiet surrender. The bank manager, though still burdened with guilt, nodded at me, a silent promise to bear witness, to testify, to never let this deception continue. The lawyer's pen captured the moment, turning fragile paper into the formal record of truth.
I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of years fall away, piece by piece. The candle that had started it all, the flickering note, the trembling handwriting came to mind. Its tiny flame had illuminated the path through shadows, guiding me to evidence, to witnesses, to justice. I could almost see it again, flickering gently on the kitchen table, patient, persistent, unwavering. I stood and brushed imaginary dust from my skirt, looking at my son. His eyes held something I had not seen in years. Calm, certainty, the quiet knowledge that he was no longer robbed of his rightful future. I bent down, hugging him gently, feeling his small arms wrap around me. "Everything will be okay now," I whispered, the words soft, almost fragile, but full of certainty. "You'll have what's yours, and nothing will take it from you again." The sunlight caught the edge of the table where the candle once burned, a golden glimmer reflecting across the room. I let the warmth fill me, feeling the room, the house, the air itself, witness the culmination of years of quiet investigation, patient discovery, and relentless pursuit of truth. As we left the room together, my son's hand in mine, I felt the weight of the past lift slightly. The inheritance was restored, yes, but more than that, justice had been acknowledged, truth had been spoken, and the bond between mother and child, tempered by betrayal, strengthened by persistence, had been affirmed. I glanced back at the old kitchen table, imagining the first note still flickering in candlelight, the silent messenger that had started it all. And I wondered, quietly, who had placed it there that night, choosing to illuminate the truth when I could no longer see it myself. But the question lingered softly, a mystery I didn't need to solve just yet. Today, the world was righting itself. Today, my son had what he deserved. And for now, that was enough.